welcome to Innovate for Growth, a show where I meet world-class creators, purpose-driven entrepreneurs, and thought leaders in growth and innovation to chat about their journeys, processes, and wisdom gained from building creative ventures doing what they love. I'm your host, Tracy Sang, founder of Internet of Stories. If you're a creative entrepreneur at heart looking to make a difference, this is for you. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Sam Book and Surmayee Tetarbe from Sassy Media Group. They're the creators behind Sassy Speaks, their brand new podcast that they launched to celebrate the 10 years anniversary of Sassy Media Group recently. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do?
Sure. So I'm Surmayee. I serve as the host of Sassy Speaks currently, but my full-time role is actually as partnerships manager at Sassy Media Group, which means that I handle all of our advertising and sales partnerships across Sassy Media Group. So that's Sassy Hong Kong and Sassy Mama Hong Kong. I've been with the group for 3.5 years now, and Sassy Speaks felt like my baby. And it's been so exciting to see that come to life, and I'm excited to talk to you about it.
And I'm Sam Book. I am the marketing manager for Sassy Media Group in Hong Kong. So as well as working with Surmayee and our art director Daisy on Sassy Speaks, I also look after our brand extensions and events and kind of our best practice in digital marketing. I've been with Sassy for 6 months coming up, but I've been working in digital marketing and content marketing different guises for about 8 years. So podcasting was just another medium to kind of add to my bow, I'd say.
And it feels like Sam's been with us forever. So
Sassy Speaks is particularly interesting because it's actually one of the very few podcasts in Hong Kong that is started by a business, although it's definitely a growing trend in Hong Kong. Can you tell us a bit about how you came about with this idea and the making of Sassy Speaks?
Yeah, so I would say a mixture of an obsessive enthusiasm over podcasts, which came very much from me. I love podcasts. I got into them in 2014 when Serial came out and have just been obsessed since. And then I moved back to Hong Kong from the States and I saw that there wasn't really anything happening here. And over the last 3 years, actually, it's been really encouraging to see quite a few other podcasts come up. For example, #Impact, Hong Kong Confidential, and now recently Talking Mental as well. So last July, I love podcasts. I thought it was something that we could do, but frankly, we just didn't have the manpower at the time. We're very young, well, not really young, we're 10 years old now, but we're youngish, but we're very small but very ambitious and very hungry team. But obviously our focus is first to our readers. So as much as we wanted to do the podcast, at the time it wasn't right. And then I met actually our production partner, Susie Jameson from Create Productions, and we met at a networking event and just instantly clicked. And she asked me, why does Sassy not have a podcast? And I told her we didn't have the manpower and the production time at the time. And she said, well, Create can really help with that. And it actually came up as a very synergistic partnership, really. We just really got along and we're like, okay, let's do it. We pitched it to our MD, Vicky, who, credit to Vicky and Maura, our co-founder, who I went to them with this crazy wild idea of let's do this podcast. And they said, yep, let's do it. Jumped on board and we're totally ready for us to take that leap. I think it came about as looking in the media space. You're right. There's not really that much happening in the podcasting world, but looking at how advertising spend has been going in the US in podcasts, going from, the MailChimp of on Serial, every single episode was sponsored by the same MailChimp ad. Yeah, exactly. And then now you look at it and there's businesses like IBM, like Microsoft, these big brands who are now advertising on podcasts. And I think that will definitely hit Hong Kong, if not, in the next 5 years. So we wanted to make sure that we got there first. We got our foot in the door. And then additionally, we also, Sassy's brand story began as a community. We're a community first and then a blog, then a business. And this was a way for us to connect directly with our readers in a way that we haven't been able to in a few years as the business has grown. And 2019, this 10-year anniversary really was for us to come back around and really give back to the community that's given us so much. And we looked at what do people like to hear about and what do people like to talk about, and how can we then further that conversation in a very candid, open atmosphere, which is why Sassy Speaks is not a scripted podcast. We were very, very insistent that we wouldn't do it that way. We wanted to just have that kind of conversation. So it came about, we wanted to reach out to our readers. We wanted to have those conversations. And of course, there is obviously a viable business model behind it, because if you're going to invest as a business time into an extension like this, you need to have solid reasoning as to why it would be worth, your management's time to invest in it. So that's also something that we definitely had to think about. But primarily it was, I just love podcasts and I wanted to make one, and I wanted to make Sassy make one, and I wanted our readers to really understand who was behind the team and who the Hong Kong community was.
But we were also very lucky in that because what we do is content and we have so much data behind that. We know what people are looking at on our site. We know what people are responding to. We know how our consumers behave because of the All-Seeing Google Analytics. And we also know how people are interacting on our social platforms and with our emails. So we have a ton of data in our hands that maybe some other businesses don't have if they're at an earlier stage in their content marketing kind of journey. It is still an emerging form of marketing for a lot of people, whereas for us it's kind of what we've always done, and it's become content marketing for other people. So we were able to plan quite far out, and we know that a lot of what we do is food and drink based. So we were obviously going to have an F&B episode. We knew that our work and money content had grown in the last year. So that was a hugely natural thing for us. And it also allowed us to kind of test out and speak to people that we would never normally have spoken to and have conversations that we perhaps haven't had. So, the response to the sustainability episode and the episode about making friends in Hong Kong were really overwhelmingly positive, and we knew they were going to be positive, but they were real highlights for us of like, people were really responding to those, and that then is something that will come full circle back to what we do on our other platforms. So that's been really interesting for us. I think as a business that's maybe not in the content space, if you were to start thinking about how to plan a podcast or whether podcasting is for you, I would first of all start out with actually looking at the communities that you do have and kind of the audiences that you would want to be reaching through podcasting. If you know that your audience is young, that, there's a good crossover with existing podcasts, that there's probably a market for you to start thinking about that as a medium. But I think that's the kind of earliest thing I would say to think about, and then start to think about, what is it that the message that you want to get across is, because, you could have a really conversational, candid podcast about life in Hong Kong, but if that's not what you're trying to get across, then that's, you could get all of the listeners in the world, but if they're not engaged with what you're trying to ultimately sell, if you're doing a podcast as a business, that's not going to work for you.
Yeah. And I think to add to that, one of the first things that we did when we were planning our podcast, and not to say we didn't know anything about podcasting when we started, we took a complete blind leap of faith. But the one thing we did know is we wanted it to be an extension of our brand. And I think that's what's really important is if you're looking to start out a podcast, be it for your business, your personal brand, for any reason, the first thing you need to do before even looking at guests, story structure, anything like that, is make sure that you have a very clear idea of who you are as a brand and who you are as a person. Because especially if you're hosting, and that was one of the interesting things that has actually come about as being the host and the strong creative director of this project, is like how much of my personality got injected into it. And I'm very lucky in that, I work for a place where the personality of the brand is very much aligned with my own personal, the way that I interact with people, the way that I talk with people. So when we sat down to create, okay, what is Sassy Speaks going to sound like and what are we going to make it like, we were very, very insistent. Sassy's always been the place you can go to if you have a question or if you want to find friends or if you want to know where to go work out. We've always been that accessible, and we wanted to carry that accessibility through to our podcast because that's just an extension of the brand. And so everything that we did, from the guests to the structure to the topics, was all about making sure we were having this accessible conversation, which is why now when you listen to Sassy Speaks, you're listening to a podcast which you could be, having that conversation with your friends. We want you to feel like I had a colleague, or not a colleague, someone I work with, come through and say, oh, when I listen to your podcast, it makes me feel like I'm just having coffee with my friends as I'm like washing my dishes, which is exactly what we want. Like that's what we wanted. But that was because that's the kind of brand Sassy is. And, if that's not your brand, which is completely fine, like just have that very clear vision when you're planning and putting the structure into place, is like really know who you are and what kind of messaging you're trying to get out there. And I think that combined with the data driven side of it, if you have that data on hand, or you can get your hands on that kind of sort of metrics to see what people are interested in, I think that's what's going to get you the most engagement.
And do you have any tips for somebody who's just launching their first podcast? Like, how do you actually go about developing an audience when you're starting from?
Interesting question. Again, we're really lucky, and I think that's partly because of our business model. We are a community-based business, but doing a podcast did definitely bring up some questions for me, like thinking about the marketing of it. The podcast distribution channels are a completely different beast, and there's a whole different side to SEO and discovery. And I think the stat I read recently is worldwide 10,000 podcasts are launching a week, which is crazy from an organic discovery challenge point of view. So for us, it was very much thinking about, okay, where are our existing audiences and what can we do to really increase word of mouth? One thing I would say, which is again slightly different to maybe, I say traditional SEO, I mean web SEO, is that you don't get as much of a long tail to kind of, build up your search engine ratings. So a lot of what you have to think about is launching and timings and kind of that as the kind of pinnacle of what you're doing. A lot of what we did for the launch was make sure that everything was positioned and ready to go for launch day so that we could get as many downloads as we possibly could, because we know that the charts are very much determined by the volume and the listen time, and that's a completely different approach to doing that. So a lot of what we were doing was all pushed towards this one day, which is why we've had a very consistent format of launch. There was one destination on our website that we were sending every bit of marketing to.
I think one of the things, the beauty of launching in a space like Hong Kong, where it's not as developed as, say, the US, is that the community here is incredible. Like, we launched Sassy Speaks, and I was lucky enough to actually know members of the podcasting community before we launched, but that community has widened and supported us so much in the last 10 weeks that we've been doing this. And it's been so encouraging to see things like the first ever Hong Kong Podcast Festival coming up in May. Like, that wasn't a thing, a year ago. No one was doing that. And then this year we've got 5 live podcasts that day. So leverage the community. I think the number one thing with podcasts is exactly as Sam said, it's not a long tail thing. You can't just leave it and let it build organically. I mean, you could, but you need to see some serious traction. And the way to do that, leverage what you have, utilize your resources, reach out to the community, see the people who've done it before you, meet people like, the Regina Larcos and the Jules Hannafords, figure out how they did it, because they did it, we all did it, and they did it from a very different point than we did, as, they're not businesses, they were individuals who launched like that. And I think, just word of mouth, you need to build up that community bit by bit, and it can be so tough, even for us, with our community as is. Podcasting is such a niche medium, and people, not everyone is into it, but then that's when you start thinking about, okay, what is my format structure going to be like? How long are my episodes going to be? So Sassy Speaks purposefully is 20 to 25 minutes because that's the average commute of any Hong Konger going to work. It launches every Thursday at 6 a.m., so it's ready on your phone for your 8 to 9 a.m. commute. That's the kind of stuff that we were thinking about when we were doing it, because you know that you're up for a challenge when you're trying to convert people into a new medium. And especially if you don't have that reach, that's the kind of stuff that you need to be thinking about. Leveraging your community, making sure your timing, your format, all of that is already set up even before you go into content, is knowing, okay, when am I going to launch it? And why am I doing it then? And then just reach out to people. People here are incredibly helpful, so supportive, and the community is small but mighty. So, utilize that community.
So which channel has been most effective for you in terms of promoting your podcast?
So we're on Spotify, iTunes, and also on Acast, which is actually our primary hosting platform for the website. I actually love their website widget. It makes it super easy to listen to. I would say being on Spotify has been incredible for us. I think that's a huge traffic driver. Obviously, iTunes also helps, and we were, lucky enough to have a production team behind us who then told us, get as many downloads as you can on the day that it launches, and that bumps you up the charts. And we've seen a marked difference from when we're on the charts versus when we're not, or where we are in the charts and positions. So I would say that's been the biggest between Spotify and iTunes. In terms of our own marketing, social.
Yeah. We are our audience is pretty young. Our key demographic for Sassy is, perhaps unsurprisingly, 18 to 35-year-old. So social media is going to be a huge element to that. But also just in terms of people sharing and adding, we were very deliberate in our marketing messaging on particularly Instagram, to encourage people to tag a friend, or to kind of, because the episode is such a conversational format, there is always a question, or there is always a kind of there's a reason why you would want to share this with a friend element. So yeah, we've definitely seen in the stats that Instagram and Facebook have been really, really, really key drivers for us. But I also think that that's because they are platforms that do encourage you to share. You can listen to a podcast and think, oh, I know exactly who I'd share this with. So having yourself on social and having kind of additional content around that on social was really, really key. One of the other things that we did as part of the kind of owned marketing that we did was for every episode topic, we kind of developed an extra content hub around it. So in an article on our website, we also put together a list of articles that we've perhaps done on that topic, book recommendations, TV shows, a myriad of different things, so that there was always something else we could keep talking about the episode, and again, encourage that sharing.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting and really fits in with your role as a media company. So in terms of business model, would you be looking to monetize it through sponsorship, or is it more about just promoting your brand as an extension?
I think for us, this was such a, shot in the dark. We didn't know. This was a completely new product launch for us because we're, even though we've got very, very strong brands in both Sassy Hong Kong and Sassy Mama Hong Kong, we've never really done anything in the audio space. We do lots of video, but, that's still something you're watching. That's something that readers are more comfortable with, and that, social media brands and things are massively promoting. Podcasting was a completely different medium, completely different platform, completely different audience format for us. So much of the first series has been about testing what the audience and what the response has been. But yeah, we're a media company, so monetization is definitely in our sights, in the plans, and also it's been podcasting in Hong Kong is at such an early stage that compared to perhaps more mature markets like some I mentioned earlier, the advertising revenues in podcasting in the UK and in the US have increased hugely, and this is a younger market. So I think we've got some unique challenges around that. But yeah, from us as a media brand point of view, monetization is something that feels like a natural fit. And also for the brands that would want to be involved, it would be such a good opportunity for them to kind of reach that super engaged millennial audience. We know from the stats that you see on things like from like people like Gimlet Media and Stitcher, that the engagement of listeners to podcast advertising is incredible compared to things like display and things like other areas of content marketing.
I'd say like a great example is like you think back, and if you were a Serial listener in 2014, I challenge anyone who listened to Serial and doesn't remember those MailChimp ads. And I think that just goes to show when you're listening to it, I can name so many brands from all the podcasts that I listen to that have advertising that I just know off the top of my head. And I think that's definitely coming to Hong Kong. And I think for us, especially because, both Sam and I have other full-time roles at Sassy Media Group. Being part of the podcast core team is something that we're passionate about, and we do kind of on the side of our regular job. And in order for me to justify that to our management, there obviously had to be a viable business model behind it. And there is. And I think that was in place before we even launched as a let's see what happens. If we go into a second season or we go into some kind of other form of, podcasting, it's definitely something that we would consider now that we know we've got the data. For us, data is such a big thing. It's one of our USPs as a digital media company is that we can provide that kind of we know exactly who's looking. We know how many people are looking. So now we have that data for this podcast. It would really help moving forward to convince brands because, Hong Kong brands don't know about podcast sponsorship, right? And so we're trying something new. And I think what that also allows us to do is extend a very unique opportunity to long-term partners. And, rest assured that we would never work with anyone on Sassy Speaks that wasn't a fit for that episode in particular. Even when we were considering sponsorship for this first season, which ultimately didn't actually end up happening. And, that's neither here nor there, nor good nor bad. It just is, we wanted to explore and see what happened. But we had very specific partners in mind that we would have liked to work with, because there's nothing more jarring than listening to a podcast on a specific topic, getting really into it, and then hearing an ad about something completely unrelated. And I've, in listening to so many podcasts and looking at companies like Gimlet Media, which is one of my favorite podcasting companies, the way they so seamlessly integrate their advertising into their podcast makes it interesting for me as a listener. So as the, in the creative direction that we'd want to take our advertising is very similar to that, is if we were to do something like that, you would never feel suddenly taken out of the episode by this advertising. And it would be something of genuine use to you. We wouldn't just like throw out some random products. So I think that's also really important, is when you're doing something as, podcasting is very intimate. It's very literally you're listening to someone's voice in your ear. And if you
that's why people are so evangelical about the podcast that they love, because you do feel like you've developed a relationship. I've been listening to some of the, because I'm also a massive podcast nerd. Partly that's probably why I'm so enthusiastic about this project. But I do feel like I've been listening to the same people every single week for like 10 years, some of them, and you do feel like and I think that's also why podcast advertising can be such an engaging medium, because you feel like, even though there isn't a relationship of feedback, you feel like you've got a rapport with the host and with the brand. And if something is wrong, it jars even more than, say, a piece of display advertising on a website. And also working with partners and with brands that are a natural fit to our audience is such a key part of Sassy as a media company. It's something that is, I think, clear to see in the way that we work with partners on our sites and across other platforms. So that would be something that in the future, would be something we'd be thinking about from both the podcast as a medium, and then also the way that we work with partners and the way that we kind of do our native advertising.
So if a brand wants to work with you, let's say they want to sponsor your podcast or place an ad on your podcast, what's the best way to go about it? Should they come up with audio creative, or is that something you would propose to them?
Well, come to me first. You can email me at, no, I'm kidding. So you would obviously work with a partnerships manager, whether it's me or my two colleagues, or whoever's on our partnerships team at the time. And we would actually treat it the way we do with our current advertorials. Our editorial team has a very strong hand in any of the content marketing that goes up on the website. It's the same editors who write it. They are the ones who develop the ideas. We just seamlessly integrate brand messaging into our content. And in that exact same way, we would ask a brand to then, first of all, see what their objectives are, see what their needs are, see if it is actually a good fit. Because, people do come and say, this is what I want. And then you look at their objectives. And it's part of my job to say, this will help you meet your objectives. And this is an absolutely wrong way to do it. Don't do this. So once it sort of fits all that criteria, we would then look at, okay, what is the key messaging you want to get out, and how do we integrate this into what's already been recorded for the content? And that audio creation and production would be on our end. We would work with our production team currently. It would be, we're very, at the moment, the way we're looking at advertising, it would be very native advertising. So it would probably be the host or, me reading out and making sure there's a good brand story, because that's what compels people. Those are the ads that I remember. Isn't just, buy this product, 10% off with X code. There's like a creative crafted around it. In that way, we would create that whole audio clip for you for the brand. And then it would be approved as a standard approval process and all of that. But basically, the way we do our current content advertising is that the sassy tone of voice is never lost, and that's exactly how it would translate onto the podcast as well. The sassy tone of voice really would never be lost. And we would work very closely with our advertisers on that.
Do you feel that because podcasting is still a relatively new format in Hong Kong, that there's still kind of an obstacle to getting people on board in comparison to, let's say, video marketing?
I mean, I think in a sense, yes, because you scroll mindlessly through Facebook and Instagram all the time, and video will immediately jump out at you. Whereas, like, when was the last time you scrolled mindlessly through your podcast app on your phone? Because I don't. Well, Sam does. I don't.
But I'm not. I'm the exception.
Yeah, we're not the majority here. So I think a lot of what you'd have to do is convert that audience, and I think what's really great about what's happening in the community right now is that there is such a wide variety of people talking about such different things that people want to know more and people want to engage more. And I think we're actually moving off, the Facebook video content a little bit, like the way people are like getting rid of their Facebook app, people are getting rid of their Instagram app because they want to take a social media detox, which, like, great, good for you. I mean, if you've done it, let me know how, because I can't. But that's I think audio is going to be this really cool new medium, and I think the obstacle is going to be convincing people that they can listen to 20 minutes of someone speaking into their ear without falling asleep, which is, again, why you need to, when you create these podcasts, like make a very engaging, like know your audience and know what kind of engaging you need to be. And I think all the Hong Kong podcasts at the moment are like that. Like, they're all so great. All the hosts are really dynamic, really fun, and all their guests are really cool. And ultimately what gets people is a good story, right? So make sure you have a good story. But yeah, I think there's going to be a challenge in getting people onto audio, because it was a challenge for me as well before I started Serial. You know, Sarah Koenig really got me. But before that, I was like, oh, it reminds me of a radio show in my parents' car when we used to drive around. And you got to get past that kind of stuff. But I think it's getting there. I mean, when we put up our first podcasting article on Sassy, and I'd pitched it to the editorial team just because I really love podcasts, guys. I really do. And I said, I'll just put together a primer of, 10 podcasts someone should listen to if they're looking to get into it. And this was in 2016 or 17. And that list went from 10 to 32. And I was like, no one's going to read this because, I'm just writing about it because I like it, but no one's going to read it. And to my surprise, like, such a well-responded to article. Yeah. It's still getting traction, and all of our podcasting articles on Sassy are getting traction. And that was, again, a big reason why we decided to go into it. So it's there. People are interested. You just need to find... I get this comment all the time, and I'm sure you do as well, Sam. Like, oh, podcasting just isn't for me. Like, I just don't like that format. And then I go and say, well, what kind of podcast did you listen to? Did you listen to scripted? Did you listen to unscripted? Did you listen to comedy? Did you listen to drama? There's so much content out there. And yeah, you're going to hate some of it. There are some Audible books that I absolutely despise, and there are some that I absolutely love. And it's exactly the same with podcasts. And I think it's just education, is getting the word out there and saying, hey, if you don't like this style, and maybe, Sassy Speaks isn't for you, maybe check out, a scripted dramedy or a docuseries. Like, I challenge anyone to listen to something like The Dropout or Serial or Caliphate, which was the New York Times from last year, and not immediately be sucked into it. I really issue that challenge. But I think it's about finding the format for you and educating people that there is something out there for everyone.
I think there is at the moment in Hong Kong, I think you're right, there is an obstacle because it is an emerging platform. But also I think the way that consumers are behaving is changing. So not only have podcasts massively, the breakout was Serial, and that has, that is a podcast that has probably spawned a generation of people that love podcasts. But people are busy, people are concerned about screen time, but people also want to multitask, which is where things like audio come in, because, you can be running, you can be cleaning, you can be on the MTR, and you can still feel like you're not wasting your time. And I think there is such a, everyone feels so busy, but that they're not doing anything. And I think not only the growth of podcasts, but the massive growth of audiobooks driven by Audible, which is owned by Amazon, have kind of shown that. So I think the stats are there. I think it's just the challenge is converting that to a Hong Kong audience, and then maybe, for a brand to be the first one to take the leap and be like, okay, I'm going to test this, because, it's understandable. You don't want to be putting your valuable marketing budget into something that isn't tried and tested. But I feel like once one or two brands do that and see how it goes, then more will follow, because that's how, people weren't spending money on native advertorial 10 years ago, but now that's the preferred medium for most brands to work with media companies. You're not seeing people putting all of their money into display like they were years and years ago. People are looking at native advertising, they're looking at social advertising. It's just I think it's the next big digital media spend place. And I just think someone needs to take the leap, the brave leap into podcasting. Yeah.
Yeah, it gets much better engagement than most of the other formats out there. I think because you're actually adding value to your listeners rather than just advertising your product.
I think as well, I think as consumers, we are now trained to understand that if we're going to be given quality content, there does need to be a payoff. Newspapers have always had advertising, magazines have always had advertising, and, we're just transferring that quality content into a different medium. So, podcasts are free, which to me is still crazy. Yeah. I'm like some of the most well-produced journalism of the last 5 years has been in a podcast, and we've been able to listen to it for free. So I think also, as part of that being busy multitasking, I don't skip podcast ads. It's 30 seconds. Like I'm doing something else. And when they are really well produced, they're not intrusive. And I think it is getting that balance that's really, really key. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're all having too much screen times these days, so podcasting is definitely a way to switch off the screen but still be able to consume information. And I also see that for each episode that you produce, there is a trailer. Do you think that's a good way to get people to come to your podcast episode when it's released? Is it part of like a mini launch plan for each episode?
It is, but I would say this jury is still out for me on that. Like, honestly, because we're wrapping tomorrow, episode 10. So one of the big things that we're going to be doing next week is a proper wrap up of, what worked, what didn't. This was such a new project for us, which has been super exciting and super fun, but also a lot of unknowns. So I think that's one of the things that we're going to think about, because I haven't had a chance to really look at the stats and see exactly what impact that's had. Does that help or hinder? Is that another push notification that's going to put people off? And there is such a fine balance with that. People do feel bombarded, and I think that's something that's still, the jury is still out on trailers.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. I think same for me, jury's still out. I think there is a benefit to it in that when you are launching a product that people don't really know about, and some of our podcast listeners are first-time listeners, whether it's because they're friends with me, friends with someone on the team, or they've just seen it and they're like, oh, let me try it, or they know a guest, which has been a big one as well. It's a good way to see an insight into what you might be getting. And the trailer is, our production team has been awesome. The trailers really do reflect what the episode would have. At the same time, I actually don't really, in my own personal podcasting listening, I don't listen to trailers. They are just
on another episode.
If it's on another episode,
marketing.
so we would definitely be looking at. I think that for us, the biggest thing is looking at the numbers and seeing, okay, what does the data tell us about what people like? Because Sam and I may like one thing, but it could be that our readers actually love the trailers, and it really helps them convert. So we'll be looking at the data after the season wraps tomorrow. Again, crazy, and we'll really make a decision on that afterwards. But I think at the moment it gives a good glimpse into what kind of stuff you can expect, what kind of conversation you can expect. At the same time, I think that can stop people from really trying something new or trying a conversation they maybe thought they wouldn't like. But at the end of the day, you listen to the episode and it's actually more interesting than you thought. Who knows? We'll see what the numbers look like.
I think data is another issue when it comes to podcasting, because Apple iTunes actually give you very little data.
Oh my God, don't we know it? Yeah.
I think just from a content marketing point of view in general, the thinking about web marketing, search engine optimization, things like that, when I started doing digital and content marketing, there was a lot more information available, and obviously the big tech companies are now able to monetize that, so have kind of reined a lot of that back. You used to be able to do amazing keyword research on Google Analytics and looking at Google AdWords, and you can't do that now. And for tech companies, their data is their it's their gold, isn't it? So I think it's good because you can see different patterns of behavior, but in an ideal world there would be more data. I think for us it's coupling it with the rest of our portfolio of channels and brands, and looking at it from that point of view. But also, so much of what we do in terms of data collection is not only looking at the kind of pure, the numbers, but we do a reader survey every year. We get real feedback from readers. So I think we'll look at doing something like that to make sure that we're actually getting, and we've been collecting all of the individual feedback that we've had, and we'll kind of sit down and look at that really objectively as well. I think as well, there's still a lot more to do about kind of, I personally need to educate myself more about, podcast data metrics. And I think that if you're in a small business, that's always really tricky. That's one of the big challenges, I think, in any type of content or digital marketing, is just making sure that you're up to speed on what all of the different engagement metrics mean, what the algorithms are, there's just so much of it. Yeah.
And it's constantly evolving, right? That's the other thing that we have to always keep on top of is, if today this data is not available, then tomorrow it is, or you're like Facebook and you change the way that you display your data or the kind of information that's accessible literally every day. I think staying on top of that is always going to be a challenge. And again, with podcasting, even globally being quite a new emerging market in that respect, I think we'll be seeing a lot more push for people for iTunes to release more data on, the data you get right now is rudimentary at best. It's not great.
It's what
but
Facebook's used to be be like
Yeah.
5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, and then you can look at someone like Facebook and see, okay, now the level of data that you can get from them is like outrageous. And I think that's what's going to happen with iTunes, especially as the advertising spend on podcasts goes up and up. But at the moment, we do have insight into enough data that helps us make decisions on, you know, what worked and what didn't work. I would obviously love way more. I'm the kind of person that's like, how many people listen to 50% of it? How many people listen to 75% of it? I want to know metrics like that. And I'm fully aware that those metrics are not available. And it's super infuriating at the moment. But I'm sure that, you know, in time that will come. And as long as we've got some kind of visual on what people have responded to, which we do, that's the biggest thing for us right now.
And what kind of brands do you think would benefit most from having their own podcasts?
Ooh, good question. Yeah, I've seen a lot of different types of branded content. So the reason that I got into podcasting branded content was because, again, Gimlet Media, a podcasting company that I adore, launched an arm called Gimlet Creative, which was an arm of a company entirely dedicated to creating branded podcasts for other companies. And I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. Like, I don't know if this is, you know, I was like, I don't think there's a market big enough for this. So imagine my surprise when suddenly Tinder, Chase, MasterCard, Squarespace suddenly launched their own podcast through Gimlet Creative. And to be honest, I've listened to 2 seasons of DTR, which is a Tinder-sponsored podcast. And if you told me that I would have liked that, I would have laughed you out of the building, but it is amazing. So I think it's really cool that businesses, as you know, such a wide variety of businesses that are doing that, and it's working. And I think at the end of the day, everyone is moving towards branded content in general. Like Sam was saying earlier, like away from display into content. And so it's all about the brand story, right? Now you're selling a story. You're not just selling a product anymore. So I think any company that has any kind of story to tell about their product or integrating their product. And I was like talking to one of my friends who owns a business here, and I was telling him that, you know, your product isn't just a product. You need to sell a lifestyle. You need to, because that's what people are doing. You need to be up to speed with your competitors, right? Like you need to convince people that they need your product as part of an overall lifestyle that they want. And say what you will about that. I think that can be a bit toxic too, is creating that kind of environment, which that's a whole other conversation. But I think that's kind of what you're selling. You're selling a brand story. So if you can work with a company that will create a brand story like that for you, or if you're able to come up with your own brand story, and it's not a hard sell, it's not that it's 40 minutes of you being like, please buy my product, please buy my product. I think it needs to be done quite creatively. And I think, again, utilize your resources. Look at what other people have done. Look at what other companies have done. See, you know, for example, Squarespace, I really love theirs. It was called Casting Call. And it was actually like a 9 or 10 episode competition on what the next big podcast was going to be. And like that was in partnership with Gimlet Media. Like that was really cool that you can do stuff like that. And that's Squarespace, like a website building company. So if they can do it, you know, if Chase can do it, MasterCard can do it, then I'm fairly certain that as long as you can create a good brand story, you can do it too.
Yeah, I think some of those are really big surprises. You know, I've felt the same about the Tinder podcast. I was like, is this something but if it's done really well, then the branding and the advertising message does become seamless, and you're it's adding value. You know, it's like, I think that is what so many brands are doing. Think about in other branded content spaces. Travel brands aren't just saying, look, I mean, some are, but travel brands that are really investing in the branded content side aren't just saying like, okay, we have great discounts on hotels in Phuket. They're working with experts in content and editorial to create guides. They're saying, we want you to come and experience this destination with us, but we want to give you extra. We want to give you the value. And that's kind of what then adds that you know, often more premium experience. It makes you kind of go, and then when you do see more of the like out of home or the trad media, you're like, oh, I remember them because I read an article or I listened to a podcast. So it gives that other element of personality, which I think Surmayee is right. It's like so key to brands. There's a reason why brands like Glossier, why things like Airbnb, you know, I'm like just basically like spouting big companies now, but there are reasons why they have emerged and become huge, and it's because they're telling a story and they're giving people something extra. It's not podcasting, but Airbnb, you know, their Instagram strategy is very much in this space. They never push prices. They never ever push anything like that. It's very much a kind of curated feed of experiences you can have. They share user-generated content, but then they tell a real story in their copy. And I think that's where podcasting for brands, whether that's you're kind of sponsoring an editorially created one or creating one in-house, it's adding value and, like Sam said, telling your story. I listen to some really, I work in digital marketing, so there is a reason for this. But I listen to a podcast that the Instagram scheduling platform Later creates, which is very, very niche, but that's a really, really smart thing for them to do, in my opinion, because, social media is changing constantly. They're constantly in it. They're the ones that are able to, share information about analytics or about trends, and they then keep me more loyal because I'm like, you're giving me this extra value. They've chosen a podcast because that's probably what they're seeing their demographic or their users are using. So I think there's so many different ways that you can potentially use them.
Establishing a personal connection, I think, is also one of the biggest ones, is when you're a brand, especially if you have a product that you find is like hard to sell, a lifestyle thing around, and there are lots around there, is at the end of the day, people will stay loyal and people will come back to brands that make them feel like a person, not a number or a price tag. And so I think establishing that personal brand connection is really important. I think that's where brands would benefit from doing something like a podcast, because like we've covered, it's such an intimate experience that you can't help but relate to the people you're listening to, right? And I think that's the kind of, you're getting such a high quality of audience listening to a medium like that. And I think the conversions would be so much greater than putting out a billboard somewhere, I think establishing that personal connection, that's a big one. So any brand that's looking to do that could definitely benefit from a podcast.
Absolutely. And finally, what would be your one tip for somebody, whether it's an individual or a business looking to launch a podcast?
Oh, $1 million question.
I have so many tips.
I know, there's so many tips. We're coming off a week where me, Sam, and our creative director, Daisy, we function as a core team for the podcast, we did like a day-long debrief on this entire project that essentially I've been working on since July. Sam and Daisy have been working on since September. So there's so many. There's so much we would do differently, I think, looking back on it, and not in a bad way or anything. It's just taught us a lot. I would say number one is have a realistic expectation of the amount of time that you're going to invest in this. Whether it's your personal brand, whether you're doing it for your company, understand that it's not as simple as, setting up. Yeah, it's not an hour. We make it look seamless and we make it look effortless, all of us, including us sitting here now, right? We all make it look like all we do is talk into some mics and suddenly magically it appears on the internet. But to give you a bit of background, for each episode of Sassy Speaks, Sam and myself listen to the episode at least 4 to 5 times before each episode goes out, and that's the edited version. For each episode, we spent an hour developing the script and the question and answer, the icebreakers, an hour of recording, an hour setting up and dismantling our studio, an hour in post-production. There's an article that goes behind it. Our designer, creative director Daisy, has done amazing design work, but that happens on a weekly basis for 10 weeks for a job that is not our primary function. And so, when we first launched this, we were like, okay, great, we'll record in September, we'll launch it by November, it will be done before the end of the year. And we very quickly realized that wasn't going to happen. And, what can you do? You're never going to know. But I think, again, use your resources, talk to people who've done it so you have an understanding of the kind of investment you're making into it, so that when you come out on the other end, you know that what objectives you've met. I'm a big goal setting person. So for me, it was about, we've come out on this end. Did we tick off these X, Y, and Z boxes? And it's cool if you didn't. It's just knowing that at least there's something to tick off. And when we look back on it, we came up with this insane step-by-step plan, essentially, for, to reflect to our team, our greater team as well, what has gone into this. And it's 72 steps long and takes 6 months of work for a 10-episode season. And I think, if someone comes to talk to me about, hey, I want to make a podcast, I would tell, especially if it's your personal brand, understand that you are your podcast. If you're looking to get engagement, you are going to be doing a lot of the word of mouth marketing. And if you're not that kind of person, which before this process, I really wasn't. I'm a partnerships manager where I'm behind the scenes. I'm not the editor here, right? And you will become so synonymous with your brand. So be ready for that and be proactive with that. Get involved in the community, put yourself out there, because that's what's going to help you the most. So I guess my 2 tips would be, plan like hell for the amount of time that you're going to invest in this, and be ready to market the beep out of it, because that's what it deserves, because that's how much love and affection and care and time is going to go into this. So be ready to market it.
I think I have 2 tips too. Sorry. I think we've touched on this kind of throughout. I think so much of what has made, I think this was a successful project, but we
fully think this was a successful project.
So much of what makes any brand, as few of the brands I've just mentioned, makes them a success is the value proposition and really, really knowing what that is from the start. I think, we had a 72-step plan, but I think that although, it does look seamless, but you can tell that the amount of work that went into thinking about that value proposition, from thinking about making sure that it aligned with not only the data but what our readers expect, to having an amazing on-brand but also different and of itself design proposition, which our creative director Daisy put together and stands completely on itself but is very sassy, to making sure that every week we were marketing it appropriately. All of that was done very much with the brand and what we wanted to achieve running through it. And I think, that fits, that's important from a content point of view. You don't want to go completely rogue because you're, with your content or with your format or anything like that. You can test stuff, but you want to make sure that when people are starting a new episode, they know what they're listening to. So I think having that really strong, value proposition and brand story is super, super key. And the other thing I would say is it's probably like a blessing and a curse that podcasting has become so huge and so slick and so well produced by these big global companies, because it means that as consumers, we're pretty picky now and we have high standards. So, it's important that you are kind of making it as good quality as you can, and, making sure that, if you can afford to, or if, that's something that's within your budget, is try and work with a company that's done podcasting before, just so that, when you are, growing your audience and looking to grow your audience, you're putting as few barriers to them as you can. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. So if our listeners have any questions for you, or they're interested to work with Sassy Speaks, how can they find you?
You can find us on our website, sassyhongkong.com, or sassymamahk.com, whichever one you prefer. For us personally, we actually have a feedback email. It's sassyspeaks@sassymediagroup.com. Feel free to email us in any feedback, any thoughts, any questions at all. Personally, you can find, my email is on the Sassy website. You can find us both under the team page. I am very much on social, so you can always find me on Instagram at YESSIRMY. Come find me there, and I'm very accessible through that.
And as Surmayee said, and then I'm also on Instagram. I'm at Sam__book. I was late to the Instagram game. Someone took my name. But I'm there. You can find me.
Great, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's been awesome to talk about it the day before the final episode.
I'll add a link to your final episode on our notes. You can find all the links, show notes, and subscribe to our mailing list for the latest episodes at internetofstories.com/podcast. You can also find us on Instagram at Innovate for Growth, and my personal Instagram account at HMTracyTang. Thank you for listening and have a great week.